Willing to share a little bit about what you talked about? Too difficult. Thank you.
So I went with the experience of poverty, thinking on a lot of times in nice institutions, there's often a misperception that our students have money and that they don't struggle with getting something to eat, having good shoes so they can walk across campus, or an umbrella to keep themselves covered. And so that for me would be something that, excuse me, I have a really bad sore throat. That for me would be the thing that I would focus on. Don't buy publisher materials that they have to spend at minimum $100 for one semester use, and they can't transfer it to anybody. So different things like that might help that student. Use open education resources, make my own materials that I give to them for free. And and then thinking upon, like I said, things in class. If I see a student that maybe appears to have, difficulty, maybe they got wet, I ask them, do you have an umbrella or something like that? Just trying to make a connection with them so that I can help identify those areas that I could help mitigate those needs that they may have, even if it's small.
Is this a campus that has a food pantry?
Yes.
Okay, right. Thank you. Another person, one more person. Yes.
So, well, first of all, I want to say I found it very humbling to see this list, because as a rational level, I know that all of this happens, but on a day-to-day basis, it's not, I can be more aware of it. So thank you for showing that list. I picked experience with finance at home, and I think when you think about how to make the classroom a good environment, is to make it a safe environment. And safe means physically safe, but it also means emotionally safe. And it also means safe from judgment. And a school like the School of Mines, the judgment is very big on the mind of teachers, because we like to write this number on the forehead of students, which is the GPA, which measures their worth.
Yes.
And how actually I took the class of active learning from the Treffney Institute, and I realized it's harder to monitor what goes on in the class, especially in terms of a safe environment, when students break out and when you're just lecturing. You're lecturing me, blah 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 blah. Okay, it's sort of one-way traffic. That's also the weakness of the whole style. So, but it's easy. But when you break out in groups, it's harder to monitor whether the things that go on in the groups are safe or
that's right,
emotionally safe.
That's right. Yeah, I have experienced that as well. I had teams where somebody identified a teammate as exhibiting extremely racist behavior, and I had no idea. And would have not had any idea had this person not had the courage to say it in the team evaluation. Yeah, thank you. So it can be tempting to think about folks who are on this list as bringing lots of need, like being needy students somehow, that we have to develop special accommodation for, that that there's something. They don't conform to what your typical student is, so they need special care, or they need special accommodation. And that's what deficit framing is, right? Understanding a group as being deficient in some way. But there are also models of asset framing. And so this is one of them. You have it on your sheet, I don't remember which side. If it doesn't look right, turn it over. These students also bring assets to our classes. Right? Yasso has provided a framework for thinking about this in the context of capital, using the metaphor of capital from Bourdieu. Bourdieu talked about social, cultural, and symbolic capital to explain how a hierarchical society maintains itself as such, and how it reproduces itself. And there are people with capital and people without. And the reasons women and people of color are not in power is because they don't have forms of valuable capital. Right? That's how that is framed. But Yasso's point is that they have other forms of capital that aren't valued in that system. And so her model walks us through some forms of capital brought by people of color. And I would like some folks to help me read through those. So the first one, it didn't appear. Maybe I took it out and put it on your handout. Well, great. So that means someone has to read it, because otherwise it's not up on the slide. So would someone read the first type of capital for us? Someone who hasn't, yes, that's fine.
Aspirational capital, right? It refers to the ability to maintain hopes and dreams for the future, even in the face of real and perceived barriers.
Right. How do they keep going with so many barriers? Thank you. What's another form of capital? Someone else who will be able to read for me.
Linguistic capital includes intellectual and social skills obtained through communication experiences in more than one language and/or STEM.
Right. So how do we frame international students, for example, not as a drag on the team because they are having problems with English, but the fact that they understand multiple languages and multiple cultures? Yes, thank you. Another form of capital. What's the next one? You made eye contact.
Okay. Familial capital refers to those cultural knowledges nurtured among familia or kin that carry a sense of community history, memory, and cultural intuition.
Thank you. The next form of capital. Chin.
Social capital can be understood as networks of people and community resources.
Right, thank you. So that sounds familiar. That fits in the Bourdieu frame. Did you raise your hand? No, you raised your. Did you raise your hand again?
No, I was just nodding.
Oh, you're just nodding. Okay, I beg your pardon. Someone else who's, I think, how many more are there? One or two? Two more? So two, yes, thank you.
Navigational capital refers to skills of maneuvering through social institutions. Historically, this infers the ability to maneuver through institutions not created with communities of color in mind.
Right, so if you are not coming with a huge amount of cultural capital on how to navigate the system, how do you come to navigate the system in spite of that, right? Thank you. One more.
I'll go.
Thank you.
Resistant capital refers those knowledges and skills fostered through oppositional behavior that challenges inequality.
Thank you. Right, so how have communities organized together over time? So I think that this is a really useful framing, right? How do we think of folks who are normally framed as deficient as in fact bringing opportunities into our classroom that we could design our classroom experiences around, okay? So here's the last activity for today. You get to choose either the context of Yasso's community cultural wealth, or the framing of domains of power that we talked about right at the beginning. And you have a activity on either side, so you get to choose your side. I want you to think about some kind of teaching context that matters to you, and preferably one that you are in charge of. So if you're not in charge, you could pretend that you're in charge. Or a class that you, or an environment where you intend to teach in the future and how you might organize things, right, if that's not your current situation. I'm expansive about teaching context. I'm suggested be about minds somewhere, but whatever matters to you. Professional development, tutoring, whatever. Oh yeah, I don't have a slide because I have a handout. And I want you to undertake a thought experiment. Right. That's framed in the context of broadening participation. So the structure of the modern American university was set up during a time when the notion of education was very different. This is why we have an academic year, even though we don't have people out in harvesting, right? Though those people were not harvesting, let's be clear. When who was educated was different, when the expectations of a university education was different, when the notion of education itself was different. Who got to be educated, why, for what purposes, and who paid. All of that was different, right? And it was organized around the shapes of lives of people participating in it. And then they were overwhelmingly male and white at that time, right? So, and of a privileged class. So there have been obviously lots of changes since then. But so vaguely, she said, sweeping over all the details, lots of changes. But so much of that institutional structure remains. And so the thing I'm getting at is there's a concept in the 80s from feminist sociologists that talked about the gendered organization. That an organization like Minds itself is gendered through its policies and practices, in that the rules and regulations and what it means to be good in those environments could be more easily inhabited, embodied by men than anyone else. So that was in the 80s. So they weren't talking, this was a problem of sort of feminist sociology as being very white. They were not talking about intersectionality so much at that time. And we can extend that thinking now to think about how we have produced a raced organization, right? That through our policies and practices, we just have to look out there that the faces are predominantly white. So that's been very successful at making a raced organization, right? So the thought experiment I'd like you to think about is if we were to start over from scratch, not start over, but like we're now, but we could set up higher education from scratch. Given our contemporary context, what would engineering look like, engineering education look like if we began from the lives of women and people of color, or began from the lives of people on this list who are predominantly or disproportionately women and people of color, right? If we didn't have the legacy of what engineering education has looked like, right, nor the external constraints that pushes it to be one way or the other, what would that look like? If we began from the lives of women and people of color rather than from white men, what would that look like? So the thought experiment is to choose a tool, the aspirational capital, the community cultural wealth tool, or the domains of power tool, and think about it in the context of your teaching environment of choice, and to spend some really good time thinking about that. There's no grade, so I'm not checking that you're doing it right. It is an invitation to, again, expand your margin of thinking, right? So let's see, is there anything else I want to say about that? Right, both to engage with the thought experiment, which is written up at the top there, imagining what engineering education would look like if we began from the lives of women and people of color living today. So I want to give you, I'm going to give you only a couple of minutes to think on your own, and then I'm going to open it up to the table. Okay, so hopefully you will be able to, I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to think on your own, and then we'll have some conversation at the table, and then we'll have a report out. Okay, so everyone clear about what we're doing? I didn't ask you how it felt to be listened to in the last gig. I will try to remember to do that. Okay, 3 minutes on your own. Are there any extras of the handouts?
There's one here.
One here. Thank you. Oh, you have some extra? Okay. Was there a question? No, okay. Okay, let me invite you to start chatting at your table. So you may have chosen different sides of the paper, that's fine. But maybe share some of the thinking and the things you're wrestling with your group.
No, I just started it when I saw her do it. I was like, do it back. So.
I'm quite cynical by resistant capital. Educational environment. It's just an amazing learning practice. Now, most concrete, you can enroll people who are saying, there's power here and it's wrong. You're enrolling them instead of distancing them. So there's that benefit, but you're also modeling accommodation with the insight that those folks have. And it can go in a lot of directions, including the progressive part of it. Just students who are interested in progressive education. So it's often students who are voicing, I'm like characterized as conservative, but like defending the status quo. And instead of defining that out, letting that be incorporated in their resisting, then through that practice, there's a dynamic rearrangement of power in the classroom and accommodation. It tends to enroll and leverage that insight even if it doesn't accept it. So this is a little bit abstract, I know I shouldn't go to that abstract, but there's something about, I think, the knowledge embedded in those students who arrive foul and are understood always is opposition. And particularly when it's folks who, and I gave the example of people who represent the status quo, particularly when it's folks who come from not the status quo perspectives, because it just makes everybody check their assumptions.
The ideas might be inspired by European conditions.
Don't think that won't roll up in there with some good music.
Right. So what introduce everybody to their own.
It's hard because it's how our brains are wired.
Sort of. I mean, I tried to make
More
sure
thinking more efficient, but we're kind of talking about our own thoughts about the thought experiment. And I said that for me it's kind of challenging to imagine
And so thinking how would it be if we started with people of color? And in my past, there was a lot of exposure to women of color.
yes. But when I was thinking of linguistic capital,
This is where
I
they were
thought
marginalized doing that.
there's some ways of speaking,
But how they did their things so
get
well.
more nods
And they were
by
inclusive of
faculty
everything.
or your peers.
It wasn't
And
like
I think it's great to broaden
years ago, like
style of
it
thinking.
was it's like Depticum.
It's challenging for me. It really is
If you start with
because
that, that's where
I can only
start
go my
over
way
to
on
see
this
what
experience. Like sometimes
these
people
are the people that started it, didn't figure when all of them women from all of them in one place, one bucket and say, you're starting all of them. They would think it would look completely different because it would be bringing people back to them rather than pushing people away. When you feel like they're dragging you with them or that you're burdening them. It was equity and there was you're going to come with us because we have to succeed. We will succeed and we can do this. Of course you didn't. I'm learning that I like this young lady.
Resistant capital person.
The more I work with her, it's great.
So I started out thinking about
better.
solving engineering problems, right? Like including engineering ethics problems. Sometimes discussions about ethical problems can be used to break the think about how the perspectives can be taken into now, was interested in knowing like just the technical from other groups and response to
But I wonder, I mean, this is how it's one great institution instead of competing with the other hundreds of climbing walls.
a total challenge.
Without that, we're just stripping everything down. They might still be able to
Crucial
and provide necessary services. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think some of the factors ethical decision-making, but this around
One issue is that some of the amount of resources it takes to get to the it's either time, money, or both.
I was sort of like you, thinking about all of these things, focusing in one area, and thinking about how science is always trying to work towards that
No, 17. 17, which is probably nothing compared to... No.
everybody
That's just...
I'm sorry, it's possible. Hundreds of thousands of students across the
No, that's just two issues. So that's a big impediment, but there's also a time issue. By the way, this is I think tenure track for having your own family is
I tried to piece apart the poverty one a little bit more and thinking about their assets.
I mean, these things,
And now,
these
are students, individuals who
your
have
aspirations are already big set, so that kind of can get
is really complicated.
into
I don't really know how to do that.
thinking about in the same way with being familiar with the structure or the navigation. Kids and I have a really hard time thinking about how to fix some of the problems we have with people that are already here because
lower middle class.
My mind's just getting back to getting so I didn't
I could see her partners in the group presenting the time barriers, extension continuing it from being able to start being she did it to us again, but so right here, but the stick with and the navigation.
Although when my kids went to school, it was like 10,000. So it's like... Actually, my oldest went to medical school.
Right, I'm glad you're here with the background that you have. So I don't know.
Euros per year.
Your engineering
And
background.
then I came with $200 to
carrying
Well, we're talking, I think too, that a lot of students probably
on top of my income when I lived at the
I'm going to be active one by the time you get to be a senior.
That's fine with me.
You can do that.
There's
He has to take some management.
It's changing quickly.
I think he's gonna do that, but I don't think we'd be allowed for students to sit back and go, that's okay. I went for physics and I was pretty good at physics, but this is what I do now. And I don't think we allow students to do that. Well, he's a senior, so he's gonna make that. He loves physics. I mean, I see him sometimes and he's like, and I'm like, how's that film going? Oh my gosh, it's on the clear. And he'll just talk about film forever. And then you talk about the class and he's like,
Just one.
But she was full of aspiration and hope when you come here to do great things. But then, experience, she said it out for experience, lots of depression and things like that, to where she became suicidal ideation. And again, I'm not sharing anything she didn't share with an entire group of people, so. But, I think that
I'm totally
I know, because I looked at the statistics.
I know, I just wanted to make sure you got so involved that.
Because these students, like you said, it's that, look at the person left of you, look at the person right of you, you're gonna be done, you know, and it's like, God, I hope it's not me,
All right, folks, 5 minutes. So folks, I'm going to interrupt you, although it is painful to do so. And I would love to hear some of what you talked about, but I cannot. And that's okay, because the more important thing is that you had the conversation, not that I hear about it. So I'm going to ask you to reflect for just a minute on one small, tiny thing that you thought of today that came up at your table. Some tiny thing that you're going to try and commit to. Okay, no, I can't try to commit. Commit! Commit! And I would like you to write it down. If you've got something written down, then star it. If you don't, just write it down on that piece of paper. I'm going to give you a minute to do that. All right, thank you. Thank you for engaging in this work today. Thank you for committing 2 hours of your day to be here. I really appreciate that. That one thing may still feel unrealistic, especially as soon as you leave here and all those other obligations come back onto your plate. It may feel unrealistic to actually do some of these things. But again, part of the exercise was to shift the margin so that the center also moves, right? About what is considered realistic and reasonable, right, in relation. So that's all the time we have. Thank you for your day. Thank you very much. Hope it was useful for you.
No, I know what I do.